Welcome to another episode on the Fossil Record. My name is Benjamin Berger, and in this video, I want to talk about Brontosaurus and whether Brontosaurus is back. Should you use Brontosaurus for that characteristic long-necked dinosaur from the Jurassic Period, or is it a misnomer, an antiquated term that should be thrown out for the more scientifically accurate name of Apatosaurus? So this is the story of Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus. Now, the discovery of fossils of large sauropod dinosaurs in the American West in the 1870s was a culturally changing moment in history. Sauropoda is the group of long-necked dinosaurs that first appear in the Jurassic period and lived until the late Cretaceous, at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs. So these iconic large dinosaurs that seem ubiquitous today were first pulled out of the hard rock layers in the 1870s. Now, the first sauropod dinosaur to be discovered was not found in the United States, but in India. A few fossils of gigantic bones were first described by Richard Leidector in 1877 from India, which he named this extinct creature Titanosaurus. Now, Leidector was a well-respected English-born naturalist who worked in India for many years, collecting fossils, principally fossil mammals, but also described these gigantic dinosaur bones from the Mesozoic of India. Here in the United States, during the 1876 Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Arthur Lakes arrived from Colorado with a number of gigantic fossilized dinosaur bones that he had dug up along the Front Range near Denver in a layer of Jurassic Age rocks that would become known as the Morrison Formation. These gigantic bones were put on display, and they attracted the interest of O.C. Marsh. Now, O.C. Marsh was a wealthy paleontologist from Connecticut who had led a famous expedition with his students back in 1872 west in search of fossils for his Peabody Museum. And upon seeing the discoveries made by Arthur Lakes from Colorado, he became keenly interested in them. He purchased the fossils and hired Arthur Lakes to head back to Colorado immediately to collect more of them for his museum. Now, ironically, O.C. Marsh named these fossilized dinosaur bones Titanosaurus, completely unaware that Leidector had used this same name to describe his fossils from India. So when later that year that Marsh discovered that Leidector had already used the name, he decided to rename these fossils from Colorado Allantosaurus montius. The fossil consisted of a sacral vertebrae, and part of the ilium, so part of the hip region of the animal. And this specimen was cataloged as a Yale Peabody Museum 1835 specimen. Now, Arthur Lake went back to Colorado and began sending Marsh new gigantic dinosaur bones from the hogback along the Front Range near Denver from a number of quarries in the Morrison Formation. And in October 25th of 1877, Marsh presented these new fossil bones to the National Academy of Science in New York. The newer bones, including much of the vertebra as well as some of the first limb bones, including a femur and parts of the metapodial bones of the feet, Marsh estimated that the animal was between 50 to 60 feet in length and more than 30 feet high. Now, rather than group all of these fossilized bones into a single species, Allantosaurus montius, Marsh split them into three species and erected a new genus. So these fossils were named Allantosaurus montius for specimen 1835, Apatosaurus ajax for specimen 1860 and Apatosaurus grandis for specimen 1901. Now, Apatosaurus grandis was a smaller specimen and is now recognized as a species of the common Jurassic sauropod dinosaur known as Camarasaurus. Now, Apatosaurus means in Greek deceptive, so deceptive lizard, while Atlantosaurus is named for the Greek god Atlantis, who was responsible for carrying the world on his shoulders. So maybe a better name than Apatosaurus for these gigantic dinosaurs. However, the specimen that Atlantosaurus is based on is pretty fragmentary and undiagnostic. So the name Atlantosaurus has been disused for the more complete specimen that was based on Apatosaurus. So in the same year that Marsh named Apatosaurus and Atlantosaurus, his greatest rival, a man named Edward Drinker Cope, had been receiving fossils from Canyon City, Colorado, collected by O.W. Lucas and a local crew from north of the small town in central Colorado. Now, these fossils are from the same layer of Jurassic Age rocks in the Morrison Formation. And these fossils were studied and named by Edward Drinker Cope Amphiocylus altus for specimen AMNH 5764, Camarasaurus supremus for specimen AMNH 5761, and these fossils were published in 1877 as well, including a remarkably large vertebrae named by Cope Amphiocylus fragilimus, which sadly has been lost. Now, this rivalry between Marsh and Cope led them to disregard each other's work. For example, when Marsh realized that his Apatosaurus grandis shared similarities with Cope's Camarasaurus supremus, instead of calling his specimen Camarasaurus like we do today, he instead referred to it as a new genus that he named Morosaurus. So this lack of acknowledgement between the two leading paleontologists of the time led to all sorts of problems in the naming of dinosaurs during this period. No one knew which names to use in referring to these dinosaurs. So in 1878, Marsh's team of paleontologists discovered a new site of dinosaurs near Medicine Bow, Wyoming, actually not far from the Transcontinental Rail station. And this site became one of the richest deposits of dinosaurs. It's known as Como Bluff. Now, excavations at Como Bluff would continue for many years. It was from this site that Marsh named some new fossils. Peabody Museum 1980 became the type specimen of Brontosaurus excelsius, and Peabody Museum 1981 became the type specimen of Brontosaurus amplus. Now, both of these specimens came from Como Bluff, Wyoming, and Bronto means thunder, and the thunder lizards were maybe a much better name than and more kind of iconic than the names Apatosaurus and Amphicoleus, which are kind of verbose and they don't have that connotation of gigantic dinosaurs and some of the largest terrestrial animals to have ever lived. So Marsh also began to acquire fossil dinosaurs from Canyon City too, from a quarry called the Fetch Quarry north of town, near where Cope's specimens were found in the year before. And instead of calling these large dinosaurs Amphicoleus, Cope's name, Marsh rather gave these fossils a new name, which he named Diplodocus longus. So from 1877 to 1878, just basically a year, we have Titanosaurus, Atlantosaurus, Apatosaurus, Camarasaurus, Amphicoleus, Morosaurus, Diplodocus, and Brontosaurus as proposed names for large sauropod dinosaurs from the Morrison Formation in Colorado and Wyoming. It was a mess. And no one was going to be touching this naming issue until both Cope and Marsh were, out of the picture. The other thing plaguing the naming issue was that few skulls of these animals had been found. Most of the fossilized bones were vertebrae or fragments of limb bones. The skull was extremely rare and not often associated with the remains of these massive creatures. The two known skulls were both found near Canyon City, Colorado. Cope had acquired a skull for his specimen of Camarasaurus, showing a dinosaur with a high, broad skull with leaf-shaped teeth, while another skull was found with a specimen of Diplodocus with a narrow-shaped skull with pencil-shaped teeth that ended up at the Smithsonian Institute, but had been studied by Marsh. The two skulls from the same region in Colorado were very different from each other. Marsh had access to the Diplodocus skull, while Cope had access to the Camarasaurus skull, each keeping the other away from each other's specimens. This lack of skulls and disregard for each other's discoveries would have a major effect on the reconstruction of these dinosaurs into the next century. See, O.C. Marsh passed away in 1899, while Cope passed away in 1897. With two paleontologists, out of the picture, scientists were kind of eager to start re-examining these fossils. One of the rising stars of paleontology at that time was a young mammalian paleontologist named Elmer Riggs. Born in Kansas, Riggs cut his teeth digging up late Eocene and Miocene fossil mammals from the Great Plains of the United States of America for the American Museum. He was hired by the Field Museum in Chicago to find some gigantic dinosaur bones out west, and rather than go to the same sites that Cope and Marsh had collected from, he visited Grand Junction, Colorado, on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, where he found a gigantic dinosaur he named Brachiosaurus altithorax. Now, Riggs had access to both the collection of dinosaurs amassed by Cope at the American Museum as well as the collection at the Peabody Museum amassed by Marsh. And working on his new skeleton, Riggs realized that Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus were the same, and he proposed to unite the two genera. Now, since Apatosaurus was named in 1877, while Brontosaurus was named a year later in 1878, both by Marsh, the Brontosaurus name was no longer valid, and Apatosaurus was the correct name to use. He published his work in 1903, and thus ending the name Brontosaurus. Well, but the name did not die. So why did it not die? Well, the American Museum had reopened the Como Bluff sites in the 1890s and had begun collecting hundreds of dinosaur bones. Henry Fairfield Osborn, who oversaw the museum, wanted desperately to make a mounted skeleton of these gigantic dinosaurs for display in New York City. Marsh and Cope had never mounted any of the sauropod dinosaurs that they had collected, and most of the specimens that Cope had collected, were still boxed up in crates that had been shipped to New York after being donated to the museum after Cope's death. So the race was on to make the first mounted museum display of these iconic, gigantic dinosaurs. So in 1904, work began on mounting a sauropod dinosaur from Como Bluff, Wyoming, to put on display in New York. And the American Museum used one of its newly acquired dinosaurs from Como Bluff, a specimen known as AMH 460, to put up. And they labeled it as Brontosaurus excelsius. Now, the Brontosaurus name seemed good at the time, since these bones came from the same layer of rocks and same place as Marsh's type specimen of Brontosaurus. And Elmer Riggs' suggestion that Brontosaurus was the same as Apatosaurus, a dinosaur from Colorado, was not widely regarded by Osborn at the American Museum. So there was a major problem, though, with this mounted dinosaur. And that is that the crews working at Como Bluff had not found a skull. So instead, skulls of the smaller dinosaur Camosaurus had been found, including the specimen in Cope's collection from Colorado. Now, also Marsh had found at Como Bluff some Brachiosaurus skull fragments at Como Bluff that he kind of used to make a very Camosaurus-like skull out of plaster. So the dinosaur in New York was fitted with an enlarged Camosaurus skull rather than its very different looking skull that we know of today. So the dinosaur went on display with this wrong skull in 1905, and it was a big success. Instantly Brontosaurus was a household name. But it also received a great spotlight in 1914 with the release of Winsor McKay's short animated silent movie Gertie the Dinosaur, which was released actually at the museum. The movie was one of the earliest animated films, and it featured a brontosaurus named Gertie. The music would go on to inspire many animated movies made by Walt Disney, including the 1940 movie Fantasia, which showcased Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus, names of dinosaurs recognized by everyone today. So the success of Brontosaurus and other mounted dinosaurs in New York City inspired the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie to he had made his fortune in steel in Pittsburgh, and he wanted to establish a public museum in Pennsylvania to feature mounted dinosaurs skeletons. And he hired Earl Douglas. Earl Douglas was a mammalian paleontologist who had worked in Montana, and he hired him to search for dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals in the American West for this grand museum. So in 1909, Earl Douglas made a really remarkable discovery of dinosaurs in northeastern Utah, which would become a Dinosaur National Monument. And excavations made in Utah from 1909 to 1915 led to the discovery of amazingly complete skeletons of both Camarasaurus as well as Diplodocus, but also some skeletal material of Apatosaurus. The skulls of Camarasaurus and Diplodocus were found, and the more complete Diplodocus was put on display at the Carnegie Museum. Carnegie also commissioned many copies of the Diplodocus skeleton to be made, which were sent to England, it was sent to Germany for display, as well as many museums in the United States. The Carnegie Quarry, as it became called, is the source of many of the Diplodocus skeletons in museums from around the world. And this specimen became known as Dippy the Diplodocus. And in fact, Diplodocus is more likely the dinosaur that you will see displayed at natural history museums than Apatosaurus/Brontosaurus. Now, the Carnegie Museum also had material of Apatosaurus from Utah. And Apatosaurus has a very different anatomy of the neck than Diplodocus. And it appeared related to specimens collected in Colorado and Wyoming. So William H. Holland named this material, this new material from Utah, Apatosaurus lucia, after the wife of Andrew Carnegie, Lucy Carnegie, which included specimen 3018, and remarkably enough, a skull was found nearby, given the catalog number 11162. There was some question about the association of this skull, since it looked very similar to Diplodocus. So William Holland at the Carnegie Museum worried that the skull may not belong to that skeleton. And he did the remarkable thing, he mounted the skeleton without a head. And that was because there was a great debate over which skull should be placed on the skeleton. Should it look like the Camarasaurus skull in New York, or the Diplodocus-like skull, like in the Smithsonian? So this headless specimen at the Carnegie Museum was labeled as Apatosaurus rather than Brontosaurus. And the lack of a head made the dinosaur not as iconic as the Brontosaurus had been in New York City. So the name was not used widely by the public. So the display in New York City with the wrong skull inspired Richard Lowell, who took over the collections amassed by Marsh at the Peabody Museum, to put up a mounted dinosaur of the original Brontosaurus material that actually went on display in 1931, using a modeled skull based on the Camarasaurus-like skull depicted at the American Museum, and using the bones collected by Marsh. So these two Brontosaurus specimens that were on display, the one at the American Museum and the other one at the Peabody Museum, were incorrect in having the wrong head. And they continue to be labeled as Brontosaurus rather than Apatosaurus. In 1931, while the Yale Peabody Museum specimen of Brontosaurus was put on display with the wrong head, the skeleton of Diplodocus longus, collected in Colorado, was put on display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., with the correct head this time. So using the skull found near Canyon City, Colorado. In fact, the incorrect skull of Brontosaurus from New York became so iconic that when Holland died in 1934, the museum in Pittsburgh finally attached a Camarasaurus skull, to the skeleton on display, even though it belonged to the wrong animal. Ironically, they had the correct skull within their collections, but would not replace the correct skull until 1972. So the Field Museum also erected a Apatosaurus, and they put a Camarasaurus skull on it in the 1950s. So Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus dinosaurs were not correctly displayed in most museums. And most people were familiar with Brontosaurus thanks to the displays of the dinosaurs from Como Bluff, Wyoming, initially displayed at the American Museum and eventually the Peabody Museum, the Field Museum, and the Carnegie Museum. But they were also familiar with the long-necked Diplodocus at the Smithsonian and Carnegie Museum, as well as many natural history museums in Europe and elsewhere. And the headless and often neglected Apatosaurus specimen on display at the Carnegie Museum just didn't get as much attention. One of the people who would have a major influence on the study of Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus was Jack McIntosh. As a freshman student at Yale in the 1950s, he began volunteering his time at the museum, helping with the reconstruction of the Brontosaurus specimens collected by Marsh. Although he loved paleontology, he got a degree in physics and became a professor of physics at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Although he would spend his free time visiting museums, studying sauropod, long-necked dinosaurs that he loved, and publishing catalogs of the dinosaur specimens housed at the museums. And he made great success in inventorying the often neglected collections of old dinosaurs, collecting dust in museum basements. And during that process, he rediscovered the skull of Apatosaurus collected from Utah in the collection of the Carnegie Museum, and he replaced the skull with the correct one. He also inspired the replacing of the Yale Peabody Museum skull, and eventually replacing the New York City's dinosaur with the correct skull. So McIntosh was also, just a really nice fellow, just absolutely loved dinosaurs, and he was willing to share his knowledge to fellow scientists. So whenever I ran into Jack McIntosh, he had a smile on his face with the pure joy that dinosaurs brought him. And this led to a new view of Apatosaurus replacing the antiquated term of Brontosaurus. With new skulls in place, museums also replaced their display signs to reflect the Apatosaurus name. So grandparents who brought their children to the museum were now schooled by their grandkids that Apatosaurus was the correct name for Brontosaurus. So all was good in the world until 2015, until Emanuel Schaap, Octavia Mantis, and Roger Benson did a unique study. They did what Jack McIntosh had done and visited all the museums and studied every specimen of sauropod dinosaur they could find in the collections. And rather than group each individual specimen into a genera or species, they used the catalog numbers. Using the data set, they then ran a computer algorithm to generate an analysis of similarity. Asking the question, which specimens are more similar to each other? Now, the results suggested that all specimens identified as Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus were both most closely related to each other. And they placed them all in a subfamily called the Apatosauria. So rather than synonymizing Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus, the authors of this study suggested that they should keep both names. So the question then becomes, well, how do you tell the difference between Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus specimens? And the authors found only one character that's unique between the two genera. They found a tiny difference found in the tail. The caudal anterior chevron bones, which project from the center, the centrum of the tail bones, has a smoother posterior edge of the distal blade when viewed from the side, which is found in Brontosaurus, while in Apatosaurus there's a slight step-like bump. Now, to be fair, the authors cite this difference as being very minor difference, and likely would not be enough to separate the two genera. However, this slight difference was enough to bring back the idea of Brontosaurus. And the Yale Peabody Museum jumped at the chance to change the name back to Brontosaurus. And the museum's currently renovating its dinosaur hall and will likely reflect that name change. Now, one of the major problems of distinguishing these dinosaurs on a single, very minor difference is that very complete skeletons need to be found in order to determine its identity. And so this has led scientists to be, more conservative in their identifications, as referring to a new specimen as an Apatosaurian dinosaur, rather than stating if they are Brontosaurus or Apatosaurus. So there are actually many other sauropod dinosaurs that come from the Jurassic Morrison Formation, up to 15 or more species. And the problem that we have is addressing the differences between these specimens and species, and whether there are stratigraphic and geographic divisions. Now, right now, Brontosaurus appears to be more common in Wyoming, particularly Como Bluff, Wyoming, while Apatosaurus is more common in Colorado. But we'll have to see what future discoveries bring.